Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Mulondo, and I'm your tutor for this subject, community-based care support 2, which is the second for the second year, and the code is CB20S2. This presentation is divided into two sections. The first section is going to give you a preparation that you certain guidelines that will help you to prepare for the exam. So I'm going to look at different aspects before the exam and then also during the exam. So the whole idea is just to give you tips, some practical guidelines just to prepare yourself for your subject. And the second session of this section of this presentation will then look at the content of the subject itself and the different thematic areas that you have to look at, which are very important for you. So we're going to go straight away to this presentation, and then the first one is to look at the tips. Now these are actually guidelines that I can give you, and from my experience working with students and also preparing for exams, marking exams and looking at students who are preparing themselves. And many students are making a lot of mistakes, and it's very important to know that you can avoid these mistakes, and you can be able to be ready for your exam. So there are certain things that you've looked at. So we're first going to look before the exam. It's very advisable that at least 2 months before the exam or a month before the exam, all depends on you, to have a timetable. Your subject is divided into 10 units or 10 chapters or 15 chapters or 13 chapters. It's very important that you divide those chapters into 2 months or 1 month. So you need to have a timetable. Very important, you have to commit yourself to those timetables. You have to make sure that you stick to those timetables, because if you're not going to stick to this timetable, you might find yourself that you're not going to be ready for your exam. So there are 3 things that you have to do during this time of preparation, whether it's the 2 months before or 1 month before. The first thing what you have to do is to read through the whole content, the whole subject, the whole manual. Read through your whole manual. Whether it's 10 chapters, you have to read through. And it's very important that during this 1 month timetable or period is divide every chapter. Say every week you will read a chapter, or every week you will read 2 chapters. So the first thing is to read through the chapter for you to understand what the content is and the context of the chapter. So it's very important. So when you're going to read through the content, you will have a better understanding what the chapter is all about. It's very important for you to understand. So don't just memorize the content, but understand the content. Very important. Then secondly, what you do while you are reading through your chapter or chapters, it's very important to make notes. Notes like words that you don't understand, circle them or underline them. This is also a time where you can look at your dictionary to understand the different concept or the different definition of this word. Things that you pick up, additional information that you in the chapter, write it down. Whether you write on your study guide manual or whether you write on a separate piece of paper or book, it's very important. Write down what you are studying, because when you are going to revise it, these notes are going to play a very important role, and it will also help you then to prepare yourself for the exam. So after you have read and you understand, you have made notes, number 2, for you to remember later on. Then, which is very important, is a revision. So after you have read, you've covered the whole content, then and preferably 2 weeks before, 1 week, all depends from you. What's easiest for you is what we call revision. So when you are going to revise, you're going to go through your notes, you're going to read your notes, you're going to look at things that you don't understand, again, for you to understand if there are questions and you need more answers. You can refer, you can go to the library, you can go on the internet. So this is the whole purpose of revision, and this is where your notes are playing a big role. So revision is very, very important. So now you are ready for the exam, and it's the day you're going to write this paper. Now, important, preferably I will advise you not to study or to revise one day before the exam. Give yourself a rest, refresh your brain, give yourself a break at least 12 hours before or a day before you're going to write that exam. Because remember, you know, your brain is like a computer, it's like a hard drive. You store the information. Whenever you need the information, you retrieve it, and that's the same way how your brain works. And the moment you're going to write that exam, you sit in front of that paper, it will be much easier because you know that you are ready, you've prepared yourself for the last 2 months or a month, and you will be able to answer this question. Now you find yourself in the exam, so there are certain things that you have to do, and this is what I call the 4 steps or the 4 guidelines that you can follow. The first one is when you have the exam paper before you, the first 10 minutes or 5 minutes before you start to write the exam is first read through the questions. If there are 6 questions, go through the question. The whole reason is you want to make sure you read through the question, you know what the exam paper is all about, what questions are there. Then secondly is then you prioritize or you select. You select the question which is the easiest for you to answer. You first start off with a question which is easier, and then you end up with a question that's the most difficult. So the problem or the challenge of most students during the exam, they first start with a question which is very, very difficult to answer. And remember, you only have 2 hours or you only have 3 hours, and sometimes it's very difficult. By the time you come to the easiest question, then your time is very limited. And then very important, that you have to know is that you have to write neatly. If you are going to choose any question, whether it's question 5 that's going to be the first question on your exam script, make sure that you number it correctly. So don't, and this is where students also make a mistake, is they number the questions wrongly. So make sure that the numbering of your question is correct. If question 5 is the easiest question you want to start with, there are no rules. You start, as long as you write neatly, question 5 is the first one, you answer it, then the next one might be question 1. So it's very important that you select the right question. And then after you have selected the question, then the third step, which is very important, is you have to read through the question. Read the question in order to understand what the question. Don't assume this is what the question is. Make sure that you have the right question, you understand what is asked. Then fourthly, which is very important, is answer the question. Don't interpret the question. Don't think this is what the question is all about. If the question asks, name the 5 areas of home-based care, then it's very important to make sure that you name the 5 areas of home-based care, and not home-based care service, home-based care services. If it says name the 5 areas of home care services, then it means you need to answer the questions about 5 home-based care services. So it's very important that you have to answer that question and as much as possible. So those are the guidelines that you can follow before the exam and then also during the exam. So we're quickly going to go through the content of the subject, and please note, you are not limited to these thematic areas. It is still important, expected from you as a student, to understand the whole subject. So you have to read through the whole subject. You have to finish that study guide, that study manual. You have to know that you understand the whole subject as a whole. So don't just be selective. The mistake that most students are doing, they only select certain chapter thinking these are the only chapters that's going to be asked in exam. It's very important for you to make sure, despite this examination scope, you still need to have a comprehensive understanding of what the subject is all about. Now, the first thing that you have to know is you have to know what are chronic diseases. Now, I've given there, for an example, cancer. You need to know what kind of chronic diseases people are facing. And then just HIV/AIDS, but only any other chronic diseases. Now, if we find having chronic diseases that are HIV related, for example, and this is where people are in the advanced stage and they're having AIDS and full-blown AIDS, and they've got opportunistic diseases because of the HIV, like Kaposi sarcoma, which is part of cancer related, or any other chronic related diseases or condition. It's very important for you to know there are certain symptoms. So you have to understand and answer in the exam what are the symptoms that can be experienced. And how do you deal with symptoms, for example? How do you address these symptoms? Very, very important. And who can address the symptoms? And it's very important for you looking after people that are suffering and that are in this condition. You have to have an understanding of what this disease is all about, or chronic disease, the condition itself. Then secondly is you have to understand infection, specifically HIV infection. It is still said that many people do not know the different mode of transmission of infection, or how people might or can be infected. So there's still a lot of ignorance, a lot of misconception, a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to HIV infection. So it's very important for you to know what is HIV infection, how do people get infected, and then also if you can know how do you prevent this infection, for an example. So now that we are using ARVs, what do you do with the issue of reinfection? Especially people think they are on ARV but they are reinfecting themselves. What are the disadvantages? What are the challenges of reinfection? So it's very important for you to know that when you are going to look at HIV infection, you need to know all these areas of all these aspects of infection. Then the other thing is orphans and vulnerable children. What do you do with parents that died because of HIV? What do you do with children that are orphans? And because they are orphans, it makes them very vulnerable when it comes to socio-economic factors, when it comes to psychological factors. So you have to read about all of this. What factors influence overseas orphans and vulnerable children? What can you do? What programs are available, for example, for orphans and vulnerable children? So you have to read through it, you have to study, you have to have an understanding the challenges, the interventions, what programs are there. You have to know all the dynamics when it comes to overseas orphans and vulnerable children. Then also nutrition plays a very important role, and food is a very important, and this is where you can discuss food security. When we talk about food security, you can also talk about the issue of a balanced diet. When you talk about a balanced diet, what are the three categories of diet that you must have? So it's very important. You need to look into details nutrition, all about the divisions of the types of food that you have, and why it's very important to have every day a balanced diet. You can also discuss, for example, when people are having an unbalanced diet, means there is no food, they don't have food, or they don't eat healthy. These are some of the things that you also need to do, have to discuss also in detail. What are you doing so when there is no food? And remember now, when people that are on ARVs, that are using ARTs, or they are on ARV, people living with HIV/AIDS, how important is ARVs for nutrition? And you must remember, when you're on ARV, your metabolism is much faster. You're always hungry. What do you do if you're hungry and there is no food and you have to use ARV? So these are all the dynamics, the factors that you have to discuss in this paper in order for everyone to understand how important nutrition is for any human being, whether it's for children and for adults, and then also discuss what interventions are there, what does the government of Namibia does, or how can governments play a role, how can NGOs play a role, what are the roles of community when it comes to nutrition, and especially for people living with HIV/AIDS. What about the community-based project or income-based project like gardening, for an example, that you can use as part of a balanced diet or to provide food to those that are living with the disease. So these are some of the things that you have to know and then also to understand. Then we come also as part of the chronic disease, it's how do you manage pain. Now remember when I first started, I talked about chronic diseases and the symptoms of chronic diseases. So what do you do for somebody that's chronic and that's in excruciating pain? How do you deal with it? How do you refer this person to health services? How do you approach your health provider, for an example, to manage your pain itself? And when we talk about pain, we talk about physical pain. And pain can be divided. It can be physical, it can also be emotional, it can also be psychological. And the question is the management. What do you put in place to make sure that you manage symptoms in the form of pain? So there are many interventions. There's a lot of programs in place that can help you and that can also assist you to make sure that you have that you are managing this symptoms, especially for people that are having chronic diseases. Then, of course, the World Health Organization, or WHO, is having certain guidelines, and these guidelines are very important, especially when it comes to treatment and adherence to treatment. The Namibian government, or the Ministry of Health and Social Services, issuing every year or second year, updating guidelines that you can follow when it comes to treatment, ARV treatment. How or what does WHO require? What are the guidelines, the international guidelines of WHO when it comes to treatment? What does WHO, or what did they put in place to help the Ministry of Health, for example? And it's very important for you, especially when you are working with community home-based care, that you need to have an understanding. Preferably also look at the different regimens, the different categories of ARVs. What are the current treatment that they are using? And when it comes to adherence, it's so important because many people are having a challenge, specifically when they're on the first regimen and they default, and they don't, and especially when it's non-adherence situation. How do you deal with these people to put them on the second regimen? And WHO, the World Health Organization, is having certain guidelines that you can follow. So get familiarize yourself with these guidelines, which are very important, especially in addressing the HIV infection and so on. Then there is another aspect that you have to look at, is the HIV screening. And when you look at the HIV screening, we've talked about it so many times. Screening which involve the treatment, which involve monitoring, management, will also involve the adherence. So there are so many things. So it's what process is in place when it comes to screening, HIV screening, starting from VCT all the way to support groups to avoid reinfection. So you have to know, what does HIV screening involve, what process is involved, and who is involved, where and how, and when are they involved. So these are some of the things that you have to look at, which are very important for you when it comes to the HIV screening. Many people don't understand. It's the same thing when you go for a health screening, but specifically for the people that are looking at the HIV status, it's very, very important. Then we've got pregnancy and HIV. Women that are pregnant, how do they deal with HIV? What impact does HIV have on pregnant women? How does it affect and affect women that are pregnant, especially the unborn child? Very important. You need to have an understanding. You need to know exactly how does HIV affect pregnant women. What is put in place to help people, pregnant women, to prevent themselves from HIV infection? What is in place? What interventions are there for women that are HIV positive, that are pregnant, to help themselves to protect their unborn baby? So it's a very wide variety of information that you need, but we have covered this before. It's in your study guide. You can also go through your manual. You can also look on the internet. So HIV does have an impact on pregnant women. You can look at Namibia, look at PMTCT, prevention of mother-to-child transmission. You look at the elimination of mother-to-child transmission. What is in place? What strategies are in place when it comes to pregnant women? You can also look at ARVs. What kind of ARVs are there for women that are living positively and that are pregnant? So this is what you have to look at, and you have to study as much as possible. Then the other issue is, how do you deal with death when a loved one dies? And even death is not just looking after death, but you are looking at before death occurs, especially for somebody that's very chronic, and you know that death is inevitable and it will happen, and somebody that's on the deathbed. Before that person reaches the place, a loved one, a friend or a family, what do you put in place as part of the preparation, and to make sure that everything is in place? And one of them is to have a will or a testament, which is very helpful, especially for those people that know that they're going to pass away. Remember, when you are going to die, you have to look at the family, those that are left behind. And in this whole process of preparing for your death, you have to make sure that there is something in place that can help the family and also those that are dependent on you, what is going to happen. And you always have so many challenges, especially where you have people with real estates that runs into thousands and sometimes a few millions of Namibian dollars. How do you deal with these estates when it comes to assets, money? And if you are not going to address this before your death, then it might leave those or the dependents in a very difficult situation, especially when it comes to the estate or the management of your estate. And many times it happens that people die and they don't have any will or testament in place, and it happened that the government has to intervene in order to manage your estate. So it's important that you need to go see a lawyer and discuss this in detail in exam paper. How are you going to deal with death and will? What needs to be in the will? So if you are going to write a testament as part of your will, what do you want? What do you want to be in that will? So you have to go and look at information, go at the internet, Google, go at the library, just to look at the content of testament and what is expected from you as the will. So I have come to the end of my presentation, and I hope that you have learned something through this, and I hope that you will be ready to prepare yourself for your exam papers. And thank you for watching and listening to me.